Winds up. Touchdown, Detroit. Josh Reynolds, 22 yards. Here's Murray throwing it in the end zone. Caught Kirk. Touchdown, Cards.
Blockers ahead. Cooks turns on the Jets. Cooks, see you later. Touchdown, Texans. Burrow lays it out there. Caught by Boyd. Makes a move upfield. Tyler Boyd looking for the angle. He's got it. Touchdown, Cincinnati.
Welcome in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots podcast. Today is going to be a mega show. We're going to still try to keep it nice and timely for everyone, but we will talk about the game day show. We will talk about the fantasy show. A lot going on, and like I said last week, there's a lot of changes that could happen with that AFC playoff picture. Or both playoff pictures, and that has happened. So let's jump right into what happened last week and what does the rest of this season kind of look like now. So you had the Packers. They are the first and only team right now to clinch a playoff spot. They clinched their division with a 31-30 win over Baltimore. Baltimore, they fall completely out of that fourth place spot down to the 8th spot. So just out. Or no, I believe the graphic will come up later. I think they may actually be in a playoff spot. They might actually be in the hunt. Either way, they fall out of first place, and it's not looking good for them. But, Tyler Huntley, we'll talk about him a little later, but he dang near handed the Packers a loss and kept them from clinching a playoff spot. The Chiefs, they move into the number 1 seed in the AFC with their win 34-28 over the Chargers. They're now at 10-4, and they're the only 10-win team inside the AFC. The Patriots, they fall out of first with their loss to Indy 27-17, putting them now at 9-5. And Indy, they move up into a wild card spot, just one game behind Tennessee, actually. So a win from them next week, a loss from Tennessee. Could see some more shakeups. Then you had Tennessee. They lost to Pittsburgh 19-13. They are now 9-5, just one game ahead of the Colts. So again, they lose to Pittsburgh, kind of not a game they should have lost. Got to go in next week and get a win, or they could be overtaken by the Colts. The Bengals move all the way up into the 4 seed out of the hunt area with a win over the Broncos 15-10. They obviously were helped out by a loss from the Baltimore Ravens. The Browns also lost. So right now they control their own destiny. If they can win out, they're going to win the division. Some other things could happen where, they don't have to necessarily win out, but when you control your own destiny, you better do it. Then we had just irritating. Again, my team that I had the highest confidence points on, go out and get upset. The Lions, the 1-win Lions. Now the 2-win Lions because they beat Arizona, not just by a little bit, 30-12. So now, what are the implications of that for the Lions? Well, they move into the number 2 pick with Jacksonville, who lost against Houston 30-16. Now Jacksonville's in that number 1 pick spot. So did it benefit the Lions to actually win this game? Who knows? They probably just did it to spite me. Go figure. The Buccaneers, they lost to the New Orleans Saints 9-0. They fall to the 3 seed, which moves Dallas up into the 2 seed. And Tom Brady, still as a Buccaneer, has yet to beat the Saints in the regular season. I don't know. I mean, of course, they have a lot of injuries, a lot of things that happened in that game. They lost Mike Evans during the game, lost Chris Godwin, who is now out for the rest of the year. Fournette's banged up, other things going on. I mean, just a lot going on and a lot happening for the Bucs that really it's not happening at the correct time in the year, trying to go down this stretch into the playoffs. And then the Vikings, they move into a wild card spot with a win over the Bears 17-9. Honestly, was 17-3. One last garbage time heave to the end zone that barely crossed the goal line is why it was 17-9. But hey, it's a Vikings game. It's got to be by one score, so they had to get that touchdown in there. But, the Vikings go out, take care of business, and now they're sitting in a wild card spot. Are they going to stay there? Who knows? I mean, the playoff picture for the NFC, especially at that last wild card spot, it's a pretty tight race between a lot of teams. And then the Eagles, they down Washington 27-17, and the reason that the Vikings sitting at 7-7 in that spot isn't necessarily safe is because you have teams like the Eagles sitting at 7-7 now after their win. So a lot going on this week. You got a Thursday night game, you got 2 Saturday night games, then you got the Sunday games, and then of course Monday. So we will get a Christmas game, right? Christmas is on Saturday, I believe. Let's take a fact check on that. Don't want to tell people wrong days, but yeah, Christmas is on Saturday. We'll have Saturday football, Saturday basketball too, if you're not a football fan. But if you're not a football fan, why are you watching the show? Anyway, so to keep this, as short as possible for everyone, we're not going to run through all of the games, but we will talk about these AFC and NFC playoff pictures. So right here, I'm going to show you what the playoff picture looked like last week going into this week, or the week before going into last week. That's what this looks like. So now, let's go ahead and give it a change up. So, what does it look like today? Well, in that one seed, of course, you have the Kansas City Chiefs sitting at 10-4. They're going to be playing the Steelers this week. The Steelers sitting at 7-6-1, just outside of the hunt. So, Steelers are obviously playing for something. Chiefs, they're on a roll. So, they're looking to keep that number 1 spot. But, Steelers could come in and not only play spoiler, but also help themselves possibly get up into a playoff spot. Then you have the Patriots. They're at 9-5, going up against the number 7 Bills. Bills are sitting at the number 7 spot with an 8-6 record. This game is going to decide, for now, who the division leader is. So if the Bills can go out and win this game, that's a big swing. They're up into that top 4 instead of being right on the edge of not being in the playoffs. It's a big game. It's going to have a lot of implications, and there's a possibility that the team who loses this could not go to the playoffs at all, especially if it's the Bills. If the Bills lose, that puts them in 8-7 with other teams knocking on the door, like, say, the Ravens, the Steelers, the Raiders, the Broncos, the Browns, the Dolphins. Like, there's just so many other teams that are just right there. So for the Bills to survive, they honestly have to win this week. Then you have the Tennessee Titans sitting at 9-5, going up against the number 6 in the NFC, San Francisco 49ers. Big game for both of those teams. Titans only 1 game ahead of the Colts, and if they lose and the Colts win, that's a huge swing right there. And for the Niners, they're sitting at 8-6. Really, this isn't going to help their position at all, sitting behind the 10-4 Cardinals, the 10-4 Rams. But if they lose, that hurts their chances of, being up there. So they are going to have to take a win here as well. All must-win games for all of these teams. Then you got the number 4 seed, Cincinnati Bengals. They are 8-6, going up against the Ravens. This is another game that winner will be atop the division. So for the Ravens, if they win, they'll take that spot back over. If they lose, there's a high chance that they don't stick in this playoff push. Then you have the Colts, 1 game behind the Titans. Well, sorry, you've got the number 4 Cardinals. But luckily you have them after an upset loss to the Lions. Colts sitting at 8-6. There's 4 or 5 teams sitting at 8-6 right now. So, got to separate themselves from the pack a little bit. It's going to be tough going up against the Cardinals, who are number 4 over in the NFC at a 10-4 record. But it's a game for the Cardinals that it's almost a must-win because you have the Rams literally knocking right on the door. And, if the Cardinals lose and the Rams win, there's going to be a flip there. At the number 6 spot in the AFC, you got the Chargers. They're 8-6. They're going up against the Texans. Unless it's something like last week where a big upset happens, I don't see this happening to the Chargers. They're clicking. They're playing well. They did just lose to the number 1 seed Chiefs, but still played fairly well. Put up a lot of stats and lost in overtime. So should be just fine. Possibly move themselves up a little bit, but they're not going to get themselves out of the wild card area unless the Chiefs lose. So they just have to keep winning to keep solidifying their spot in the playoffs. And then at the number 7 seed, we just talked about them a little earlier, is the Bills going up against the Patriots. So again, huge implications there. And then we'll give you a second to look over at the in the hunt teams. You got the Ravens, the Steelers, the Raiders, the Dolphins, the Browns, the Broncos, all sitting at 8-6, 7-6-1, or 7-7. So everybody is knocking on the door to try to get in there. But again, it's going to come down to we've got 3 weeks left. Make it your goal to win out those 3 weeks and see where you sit after that. Because it's looking like 10 wins is going to be the cutoff, or you're not even going to have a shot. In the NFC, here's what it looked like last week. A few changes, primarily the Cowboys, honestly. But looking at it now for this week, you got the Packers sitting up there at 11-1. They clinched their division. They are the only team so far to be guaranteed a playoff spot. They're going up against the Browns. So Browns, they just, had a game that they won. Or no, they lost 16-14. But there's just so much going on with the Browns. It's not looking good. Hopefully they get, a lot of the people back from COVID that they didn't have last week. But the Packers are looking good. I don't think the Browns are, necessarily as good of a team as the Ravens. But they do have a good defense. If they do have people back from COVID, like Jadeveon Clowney, it's going to make life a little difficult on Rodgers. But I think the Packers are fine, and they should be sitting up here in the 1 spot again next week. Then you have the Cowboys moving all the way to number 2. Vic Quick has been talking all about it. We'll have to get him on the show at some point. Maybe, when the playoffs start, we'll see about getting him back on the show so he can talk a little bit about his Cowboys. But they're sitting at 10-4. They've got Washington again this week. They just squeaked out against Washington a couple weeks ago. Is this game different? If it is, you have the Bucs, the Cardinals, the Rams, all just sitting there waiting to knock the Cowboys back down to 4th if they lose. But, Washington, they just lost again on Tuesday against the Eagles. Kind of floundering, but, again, they had some COVID things going on. But I don't see it happening. The Cowboys' defense is really just starting to impress me a little more than normal. So I think Cowboys will be all right there. Then you have the Buccaneers sitting at 10-4, going up against the Panthers. And most of the time you'd be like, yeah, this is no problem. No big deal for the Buccaneers. Well, they won't have Chris Godwin for sure. Mike Evans, who knows? Leonard Fournette, who knows? Other pieces of that offense, who knows? They're kind of sitting like the Browns almost, with just a lot of injuries, a lot of things going on around the organization that are going to get in the way. So do they pull it off against the Panthers, or do the Panthers get an upset? Who knows? But the Buccaneers they're fine division-wise. If they lose, the farthest they could fall is down to number 4. I think with the Saints being the only team in their division close and still 3 games behind. So even if they lose, I think they'll be okay, but I don't foresee them losing. And then in the 4 spot, you got the Cardinals. We talked about them a little bit when we talked about the number 5 AFC seed Colts. But they're sitting at 10-4, coming off of that really embarrassing loss to the Lions. And again, it's a must-win because you have the Rams nipping on your heels, and if they win, you're gonna fall. And then it's going to be an uphill climb from, being at that 1 seed, dropping all the way down to in the hunt, and then clawing your way back to win that division. The Rams, they're 10-4. They're going against the number 7 Vikings. So congratulations, Vikings. You're in a playoff spot right now. Now go play the Rams. Go play Aaron Donald. Go play Von Miller, who just got his first sack as a Ram. It's going to be a tough test, and the Vikings, they've been fighting very hard to make this a season for them, and there's still a chance, even with a loss this week, that they can get in, but it's going to be definitely difficult for them with everybody else behind them. And then you got the Niners sitting at the 6th spot. They're going up against the number 3 Titans, who we talked about earlier. They're kind of figuring things out, figuring out what their team needs to look like now to start winning games, and they're doing it. Deebo Samuel is becoming kind of the better version of Cordero Patterson, the do-it-all guy, and that's really helping them a lot as well. Their defense playing pretty decent, and going up against a Titans team who's not necessarily all the way there. They're kind of floundering on their own and getting lucky, having a few pretty easy matchups every couple of weeks. So it's a game that I think the Niners can go out and win as they try to chase down the Cardinals and the Rams in that division. We already talked about the Vikings, so let's go down to who are some of the teams in the hunt. You got the Eagles at 7-7, the Saints at 7-7, Washington and the Falcons both at 6-8, and the Panthers and Seahawks, who necessarily aren't out of it, but not necessarily in it, sitting at 5-9. So that's going to do it for the game day portion of this show. A lot going to go on, a lot of games. We got Christmas game. We've got, games on Thursday. Hopefully no more reschedules this week. Tuesday football definitely threw a monkey wrench in these plans for podcasting. So hopefully everything stays to schedule. But now let's move on to the fantasy show. All right, so now it's time for the fantasy show. We've got your fantasy kings, your top quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, and then we're going to quickly run through who are some of the quarterbacks this next week, or not just quarterbacks, who are some of the players this next week that are really going to be your semifinal studs and help you move on to your fantasy championship. I didn't have to sweat it this week, but I still would have been okay. I got the high score throughout the league, but now it's really crunch time, and I'm actually going to have to start playing. So who are going to be those people? We're going to start off with the Fantasy Kings, and these first 2 names, you definitely did not pick them to be the top guys starting the last week. But at quarterback, you have Tyler Huntley. He had 35.9 fantasy points with 215 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 73 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. At the running back position, but you didn't choose him either, Duke Johnson. And looking at his jersey, looks like he plays for the Texans. No, he plays for Miami now. He had 25.7 fantasy points, 107 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 1 catch for a 20-yard touchdown as well. Cooper Kupp finds himself back up into the top players. He had 34.7 fantasy points, on 13 targets, 9 receptions, 136 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a singular rushing yard. Then at the tight end position, top scorer of everybody, Travis Kelce. He had 41.1 fantasy points, 13 targets, 10 receptions, 191 yards, and 2 touchdowns there as well. Now let's move on to the top quarterbacks, where Patrick Mahomes was right in that runner-up spot. He had 29.6 fantasy points with 410 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. He also added 32 rushing yards on the ground. Jalen Hurts sitting at the 3 spot. He had 27.64 fantasy points with 296 through the air with a passing touchdown and an interception. But he also had 38 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Then you had Aaron Rodgers. Every time I say Rodgers now, I brought up to my girlfriend the older State Farm commercials. And all I can think of is the guy with the cheese on his head going, Rodgers! Rodgers! Discount double check! So, anyway, Aaron Rodgers, he had 23.82 fantasy points with 268 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 11 rushing yards. And then Cam Newton snuck his way up into the top 5 with 23.34 fantasy points, 156 through the air, a passing touchdown, an interception, 71 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. Over to the running backs, we had Jonathan Taylor, who did it strictly on the ground. He had 23 fantasy points with 170 rushing yards and a touchdown there. Jeff Wilson Jr., the guy that I had on my IR for nearly the entire season, and then cut him because, he came back, didn't do anything. He's sitting at the number 3 spot with 19.9 fantasy points. Put 110 in on the ground with a touchdown there, and added on 2 receptions for 9 yards. Antonio Gibson, who was sitting on my bench, but it didn't matter. Again, had a bye week, didn't matter. He had 18.5 with only 26 rushing yards, but had a touchdown on the ground, and then added on 6 receptions for 39 yards. Austin Eckler rounds out that top 5 with 18.2. He had 59 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown with 4 receptions for 23 yards to add to it. To go to the wide receivers now, we had Tyreke Hill, who was just edged out by Cooper Kupp for that top spot. He had 32.8 fantasy points, 13 targets, 12 catches, 148 through the air, and a touchdown. Brandon Cooks, you heard his name earlier in the intro. He had 29.2 fantasy points, 10 targets, 7 receptions, 102 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Gabe Davis, I talked about him a couple weeks ago because I was like, hey, he's, just a small guy that could do something. He finally did something. He's number 4 on the wide receiver list with 25.5 fantasy points. He had 7 targets, 5 receptions, 85 yards, and 2 scores. And then you had Christian Kirk rounding out the top 5. He had 24.4 fantasy points with 12 targets, 9 catches, 94 yards, and a touchdown. His production could stay there as well if D-Hop, is not in anymore for this season. And then finishing off, we have the top tight ends. You had Mark Andrews. He scored 35.6 fantasy points, 13 targets, 10 receptions, 136 yards, and 2 touchdowns. It was honestly the week of the tight end. All of these guys in the top 5, except for the last guy, had at least a touchdown, and the top 3 all had 2 touchdowns. So the week of the tight end. Moving on to number 3 was Hunter Henry. He had 25.7 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 catches, 67 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Dalton Schultz had 20.7. He had 8 targets for 8 catches, 67 yards, and a touchdown. And then Dallas Goedert right behind him. The only guy not to score a touchdown, but he still had 20.5 fantasy points with 9 targets, 7 receptions, and 135 yards. All right, so let's move on to the fantasy studs for these fantasy semifinals. Not guaranteed locks, but guys that I think will have good games. For the quarterback position, the top guy I think this week is going to be Justin Herbert going up against Houston. It's just a really good matchup. Herbert is a guy that has gone out and had multiple top fantasy quarterback weeks, so I think Herbert's going to be that top guy, followed by Joe Burrow, honestly, against the Baltimore Ravens. We saw what happened the first time Cincinnati played Baltimore. Baltimore is now reeling. They're just not doing very good at all. Bengals have the newly found power spot in the division. I think Joe Burrow, he had good plays last week against Denver, primarily one long pass to Tyler Boyd. So I think he has a good week as well. Jalen Hurts going up against the New York Giants. I think he'll be, up in that top 5 as well. He was just the quarterback 3 this week. What's to say he can't do it again against a pretty terrible, let's be honest, New York Giants team. So I think we can see another big week from him again this coming week. Aaron Rodgers, I said earlier, it could be a little tough for him if Cleveland gets everybody back, if they have Jadeveon Clowney on one side and Myles Garrett on the other. That is true, but they're also pretty banged up. Rodgers is playing extremely well, in that MVP conversation as quarterbacks are, but this is a game where, I think he can go out and have a just fine football game. And then Matt Stafford up against Minnesota. There's going to be points scored. It's going to come down to one score. And that Stafford has Cooper Kupp. So I think Stafford, again, normally when I think he's going to be in the top 5, he is. This is a week I think he'll be in the top 5. Some other notable mentions, you got Kirk Cousins going up against the Rams, Tom Brady going up against Carolina, but again, that could be shaky because of the weapons he has out. And then Pat Mahomes up against Pittsburgh. That's a coin flip game, honestly, but the Chiefs are on a roll. So he's another one that could give you a good week for this round 2 of the playoffs. Let's take a drink. At the running back position, the top guy I think is going to be Austin Eckler. I'm going to kind of continue to hit on this all the way into, I believe, the wide receiver section. But Chargers have that game against Houston. I just think it's going to be a good offensive showing, at least for most of the game. And if the Texans do somehow make this a competitive game, that's going to equal more offense, I think. So either way, a lot of offense coming for this Chargers offense. So, Herbert, Eckler, they're going to benefit from that. At number 2, it's going to be kind of tough, but it is Jonathan Taylor. He's honestly making a case to be the NFL MVP as well. He's going up against Arizona, though, so that's where it gets a little difficult, but I think he'll be fine, and I think he'll have a great week. Moving on to the number 3 guy. Because he's going up against Detroit is why I put him here, even though he hasn't done a lot the past few weeks, and that's Cordero Patterson. It's been a rough few weeks, and I'm just like, come on, Cordero. Especially, sure, he had an off week last week. That's fine because I was not playing anyone last week. Now I am playing somebody, and I want to play him. I think that this is just fine for an opponent, and I think he'll be okay. At the number 4 spot, I think you'll see David Montgomery. He's going up against Seattle. I don't on hand have how many points he had against. Or no, they're not division rivals anyway. I don't know what I'm talking about. He's doing pretty well, though. And if we remember last year, the last 3 games of the season, David Montgomery absolutely went crazy. And there's a chance he could do it again this year. So let's go out and see it. If you have him, go ahead and fire him up because he, for some reason, is playoff fantasy Montgomery. And then at the number 5 spot, we're going to go with Joe Mixon. It's kind of the same thing I'm thinking with Burrow. The offense is going to be clicking. It's against a floundering Baltimore defense. Joe Mixon is pretty good, so why not? Why can't he be up in that top 5? Other honorable mentions, Dalvin Cook going up against the Rams and Josh Jacobs going up against Denver. Jacobs had a big week last week. Denver's not a slouch of a defense, but maybe momentum stays with Jacobs and he continues to do very well. And then you have Alvin Kamara going up against Miami. Could be a good game, but Miami's on fire, so are they going to stop Alvin? That's a possibility. Then at the wide receiver position, you got Deebo Samuel. Just kidding. Starting at the top spot, we're going to go with Cooper Kupp against Minnesota. For all the same reasons we said things about Matt Stafford, Cooper Kupp coming off of a top fantasy wide receiver game, I think he goes out and is just fine. Then Keenan Allen. I again said we were going to hit the Chargers pretty hard, and Keenan Allen against Houston, he's really started to become what he was last year, which is just volume. And going up against Houston, it's going to be good. I could see a touchdown or maybe even 2, depending on how the game goes, for Keenan Allen. Number 3, you got Devontae Adams going up against Cleveland. If Rodgers is going to have a good day, it's going to have to be somewhat through Devontae Adams. And normally, if it's somewhat through Devontae Adams, it's a lot through Devontae Adams. So I think this week will be good for him. Now Deebo going up against Tennessee. The guy's a running back. He's a receiver now. He went to the front office. He said, "Hey guys, that Cordero Patterson guy, I like how much he touches the ball. Go ahead and just throw me into that same situation. We'll be fine." It's working out. He's doing really well, and I think going up against Tennessee, whose defense, sure, they've got a few shutouts, but they're against not good teams. Let's see what they do against Deebo, this offense that is doing pretty decent, not throwing the ball all that great, but running it very successfully. Let's see how Tennessee's defense holds up against that. And then at number 5, Tyree Kill going up against Pittsburgh. If you keep giving him all of the targets that he's getting, he's going to continue to produce numbers. Some other honorable mentions. A guy who had a big week last week, Amon-Ra St. Brown, going up against the Falcons. Could be a good matchup there. Justin Jefferson on the other side of Cooper Kupp going up against the Rams. He had a touchdown last week. He's just been continually putting it on. The only thing that kind of keeps me from thinking he'll be, top 5 is they didn't have a lot of passing yards last week. It was against the Bears, and the Bears just know how to play division people, so that could have been part of it, but still, proceed with caution. Elijah Moore for the Jets going up against the Jaguars. He's had a few good games. Devontae Smith going up against the Giants. Who knows? I think he dropped a touchdown this past week, but dang near had it, so that could be good. Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, in that order, against Baltimore. Any 3 could be good. I think Jamar Chase is going to see the majority of the targets, but who's going to have that touchdown? Who knows? Hunter Renfrow, speaking of target hogs, he's one of those guys. I put him in the past few weeks just as one of my top receiver options, and he goes out and gets 9 to 12 targets, and it works out. And then Jalen Waddle going up against New Orleans. Give him the little dance. I think it'll happen. Then you got Tennessee, the tight end position. For the top guy, I think it's going to have to be Travis Kelce going up against Pittsburgh. Seeing that 41-point outing, 13 targets, the offense essentially runs through himself and Tyree Kill. They're starting to figure that out, and that's kind of why they've started winning so many games. Don't quote me on it. Maybe that's not the actual reason, but it's the reason I see. They weren't giving them a lot of some games that they were losing. Not a lot of targets to those guys. Now we see the shift. 26 targets between the two last week. Get them the ball. And then George Kittle, he missed the top 5 this past week, but he was the top tight end 2 weeks in a row. Going up against Tennessee, again, we're going to have to see what Tennessee's defense really looks like, or be reminded what their defense really looks like against a team that is competent at playing football. Rob Gronkowski going up against Carolina. If Evans is out, with Godwin out, Fournette could be out, we could see a lot of volume going to Gronk. Just drawing everything up for Gronk to go out there and play. I think it's going to be a very big week for Gronk, which kind of scares me because I'm going up against him. So maybe just keep it a little big. Just a little bit. Not a lot, just a little. Then you got Mark Andrews going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. Andrews, I'm pretty sure, has been inside the top 5 for the past 4 or 5 weeks. The guy is just going crazy, and he's doing it with a lot of targets, touchdowns. It doesn't matter who his quarterback is. They're going to be looking for him because he is becoming just one of the better tight ends of the entire league. He was already there, but now he's scratching the surface of top 3. Then for the number 5 spot, had he had a touchdown last week, it would have put him up into the 3rd tight end spot. Dallas Goedert going up against the Giants. That's obviously a great matchup. He already had a good game against Washington. I think they continue to look his way, and it's a good game for him. Some honorable mentions. Kyle Pitts, again, going up against Detroit, could be good. I think Pitts even had a pretty big catch last week. Didn't amount to really, any fantasy implications, but I think he's got a chance at a good game this week. TJ Hawkinson on the other side going up against Atlanta. Hawkinson is one of the better targets for Detroit, but with Amon-Ra St. Brown apparently becoming a guy, who knows how much that would cut into a TJ Hawkinson. And then Dalton Schultz was up in that top 5 last week. He's going up against Washington. Could be another big week for him, so we'll have to see how that goes. But promised you we'd keep it a little short. Looks like we kept it about on time. So that's it for this week, guys. Good luck with all of your picks. Have a good Christmas. Good luck in your fantasy matchups. And hopefully the best Christmas present you get is a fantasy win this week to go to the fantasy championship. I'll be thinking of all of you. Hopefully, wish me some luck. But again, Merry Christmas. Have a good weekend and enjoy the football.